Welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I am thrilled to be joined by Chad Towarnicki, author of Notes from a Deserter, published by HTF Publishing. Chad, welcome.
Good morning.
Well, let's start with the format of this novel, novella, short story cycle. It's a little bit unique, so tell me how it's structured.
Functionally, I just started writing short stories, just trying to get short stories published because I was new to the writing experience. I started writing this when I was in grad school at Arcadia University outside of Philadelphia. And we had like a rotating schedule where we just had to submit tons and tons of writing. So I was looking for anything to write about. And I had this experience where a woman pulled into my driveway looking for directions, actually on Mother's Day. And she was looking for directions to a grave that was somewhere in the woods here that I didn't know about. And that kind of started me researching Hal and his experience, how he went and enlisted. And each kind of step of the way that I was learning about kind of the culture of America during the Civil War, I just focused in on one big cultural transition that took place and tried to craft a story about like a new technology or like a national change in mindset, and just tried to find a story and a narrative that encapsulated that cultural change. And after several years of doing that and several years of research, I was able to kind of daisy chain them along and kind of fill in the blanks of Hal's experience and how he ended up fighting in Fredericksburg for the Union, and how he came back to Perkiomenville, and uh, there was a botched citizen's arrest, and he was arrested for killing one of the bounty hunters and then hung at Fort Mifflin ultimately. So the short stories kind of daisy chain windows into that experience and the culture of the time period.
So, just for clarification, you had mentioned Howe, and that's our main character, William Howe. So, tell us, who is William Howe? And you also mentioned a woman who stopped in your driveway looking for directions. I think that's kind of how you discovered his story. So, give us a little bit more detail into how you discovered his story and who he is and why you wrote about him.
Yeah, so the grave she was looking for is just like an unmarked grave. It's nothing noteworthy, just off the road in Perkiomenville. And there's not really anything in the historical record. There's just um, kind of anecdotal information about who Hal was himself. Um, but living so close, like literally living two properties away from where he lived, his house is no longer there or anything, but we live two properties away. Um, so Essentially, he was just a farmer living in the agricultural suburbs of Philadelphia. And the story I was able to piece together is essentially just trying to make a name for himself as a German immigrant. He enlisted in Philadelphia. And what ultimately happens is when he's fighting in Fredericksburg, part of what I try and enhance in the book is how squalid the living conditions were for soldiers in the Civil War. And one statistic I came across is that for every 1 day of battle, the soldiers had 28 days living in camp. And their camps had like no clean water, very thin rations. They were exposed to the weather. They were undersupplied in terms of gear and just literally just survival gear to get through winters and stuff. So he very likely had dysentery just from living in the camps. So after the Battle of Fredericksburg, it was an enormous loss for the Union, and most of the commanding officers all fled back to Philadelphia to with their tails behind their legs to recover. And that's the point in time where I do know that Hal left. And the assumption I make from the research is that he wasn't wounded, and all accounts, the few accounts that there are of him at Fredericksburg, speak to him fighting valiantly and following through on everything that was required for him as a soldier. And after Fredericksburg, it's impossible to know how he got back to Perkiomenville, but he started walking and got back to Perkiomenville in December. And then, as the story goes, a local bounty hunter named Abraham Berthollet um, was involved in the citizen's arrest and actually let the news slip what they were in Perkiomenville to do at the Perkiomenville Hotel, which is a real building, which is maybe like 2 miles from my house. And since it was such a close German colony up here, they gave word to Hal about the bounty hunters looking for him. So he was ready when they came to his house at night, and a firefight ensued. Um, and one of the bounty hunters ended up dead. So there was a trial that took place, which is omitted from the book, but there was trials that took place um, where it's unclear whether the bullet that killed the bounty hunter would have matched the firearm that Hal had. It's a little bit unclear. And he did write directly to Lincoln with some of this information. And despite the effort to clear his name, he was hung. So his body was brought back to our local Obelisk, Pennsylvania graveyard, and they actually rejected his body because they didn't want to seem like they were sympathizing with the deserter and anti-war sentiment of the time. So they rejected his body, which is how he ultimately ended up being buried on the roadside in Perk Gilmanville back on his own property because it was just the only place where they could put the body. Um, so Hal is a little bit of an enigma in himself, which gave me the opportunity to focus on the culture of the time period and just let Hal kind of like haunt the stories. Um, he's a central figure, but he's kind of a background entity in the piece. And kind of having some of that ambiguity and that unknown nature of who he truly was as a person kind of opened that door for me to focus to use him as like a pivot point to focus on the time period that he was living in. So at the risk of rambling, that was inspired by a Western painter named Charlie Russell. When I was at the University of Montana for undergrad, um, there's a huge museum dedicated to Charlie Russell in Great Falls, Montana. But he took a similar approach. He painted indigenous peoples and cowboys of the West and ranchers. But the scenes that he paints are kind of like time capsules of the culture that he saw as being a very temporary, dynamic time period that was rapidly changing in his experience. So I kind of used uh, his approach to painting as kind of like a framework model for how I was encapsulating the time period of the United States, the Eastern United States in the Civil War.
Well, you covered a lot there. It is a really interesting story, and I can understand your fascination with it and why you decided to write about it. I want to bring up a couple things. Now, I love your writing style. I love the different stories that you share, which is why we were publishing this novel. I wonder if you could talk about two things. One is the way in which you are able to share multiple perspectives of the war, because you're talking about Howe's experience, William Howe, as a deserter and the things he went through at Fredericksburg. But then you're able to pull out a story of a Civil War doctor, or a story of escaped slaves, or a story of a Civil War photographer, or his wife who was left at home with the children. Um, or even one that really struck me was the guy who was selling goods to the living soldiers that he took off the dead bodies of the killed soldiers, and the dynamic between those soldiers and the he had things they needed, but he was taking them from their friends, and that was just such a something that you don't think about, that this went on. So I guess now I'm rambling, but talk a little bit about your ability to encapsulate all these multiple perspectives. But then, in addition to that, we've talked a lot about the research and the history, but there's very little like facts that are delineated through dates or numbers. You have a very great way of humanizing these people and sharing these facts in a way that's extremely relatable and emotionally telling. So, talk about that the writing style and your ability to humanize these events, and then also how you're able to uh, share all these different views of what was going on in the United States at that time.
But first of all, I really appreciate that analysis of the writing. So I think the thing that I learned from this project is when you think of the Civil War, you think of like a battleground that's over there, and after having gone to a lot of the battlefields, it's like this is where the war took place. But the more you read about the Civil War, it took place everywhere. It really impacted. I mean, I was blown away by one thing that I read where Abraham Lincoln was working in the Oval Office at the White House, and he could hear the cannon fire from Gettysburg, like 60 or 90 miles away. I forget how far away it is, but like the like not to use a pun, but just like the blast radius of the war. There's Southern universities that don't have graduating classes because all of the men died in the war, or all of them went to war and never came back. So I think what blew me away, and a lot of the writing took place in the pandemic, and it's funny, like the pandemic didn't happen just in one place. It happened to all of us at the same time, affected all of our perspectives at the same time. And I think what the realization I had was that the Civil War very much was like that. It was, um, you know, 20-25% of males in a given state went to the war. That means that all of their wives were left to uh, undergo this transition where previously there was this like Victorian perspective of gender roles and everything, and then this huge percentage of men go off to war, and the women are just left to figure out how the planting's going to go while they're rearing the children, and they have to take care of all the livestock and everything as well. And conversely, the men who went to the war were, to use Hal for an example, these guys from agricultural towns, they didn't have like a huge cultural exposure. They wouldn't have interacted with thousands of people in their lives like we do now every day. For them to leave the small towns that they were from of just a couple hundred people and join a platoon of 1,000 people, and then march across state lines, and march out of the hills of Pennsylvania, and end up in some southern state that they would never have traveled to otherwise and would never be back to otherwise if they survived. It's just fascinating to think of somebody from an agricultural town camping outside, like takes place in the book, camping outside of the Potomac River, and you can see the Washington Monument being constructed, and they have hot air balloons. It's the beginning of the aeronautics program. It's the first time flights used in American war is hot air balloons being used for reconnaissance during the Civil War. I mean, it must have just been like space age technology to these people. So I think that's the major takeaway I had from researching the book was that the Civil War wasn't something that just happened to a couple thousand guys at Pickett's Charge or at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Or the war wasn't just happening there. The war was happening everywhere nationally. It was impacting everyone's perspective. Um, so to that point, in terms of humanizing the characters, I was trying to just embody that idea of, to use Hal's wife, for instance, being a pregnant mother and your husband just left, and now you're in charge of the children and the house and the property and all the agriculture that would be taking place, and not knowing whether this person's ever coming back. It's just such a monumental sacrifice for the country. It's almost impossible to get in the headspace other than to be a spouse of somebody currently at war. Maybe they're the only ones who can truly understand what that sacrifice is like. But um, I was just trying to embody that. It was not unlike the pandemic. It was a huge cultural shift that happened in a very short period of time, like basically 4 or 5 years, where the world was never going to be the same, the country was never going to be the same, and it changed so much, all the way down to just simple interactions between neighbors and simple interactions between um, the even the soldiers in their downtime. There's a story where, as I mentioned, the soldiers had so much downtime in camp that they would actually be trading. Union soldiers would meet with Confederate soldiers and trade goods because one side had access to coffee and the other side had access to fresh fruit. And these were commodities that they were desperate to have. So they would trade goods, and then, a week later, they'd be in these gruesome battles against each other. It's just a really fascinating, it was a really fascinating project to try and embody uh, that perspective and that change that what happened in American culture.
What did you think about some of the stark realities that you came across, whether it was amputation or death, as far as seeing that in your research? How did that feel for you, and how did it then feel for you then to put it on the page?
I think it's just a realization of like just the like utilitarian nature of survival. The first thing that pops to mind is reading journal accounts of Fredericksburg, and the people, the citizens of Fredericksburg had to leave because the city was kind of occupied, and journal accounts. This is one thing that I do kind of like reference in the book is journal accounts described the soldiers on the hillside in the fields the next morning. They looked like sheep in the field because through the night the soldiers were freezing in town, and one way that they were trying to survive was they went out onto the field and they took extra layers from the dead soldiers in the field to help layer up to survive because the battle took place in December. So they were literally just trying to not freeze to death through the night. So they took the uniforms of the fallen soldiers in the field, and then the next morning there's just these nude corpses in the field. So I think that true survival on such a mass scale to soldiers who are already pushed to the brink just by the squalid living conditions of the camps, they're all, and having traveled so many miles on foot, malnourished, and then to the survivors who survived a battle and are still in the platoon and moving on to the next, the immense amount of PTSD that they're dealing with. And um, it's there's just so many psychological moving parts to it to examine what these guys were going through. Um, it's just remarkable.
Well, let's shift and talk a little bit about you. You had mentioned you had an MFA at Arcadia University. I also have an MFA, and I guess I want to ask you about it because of how much I appreciate what I learned in my MFA program. And being a part of different writer communities, there's always a little bit of a debate: is it is it worth it, the cost of going to an MFA when you can do workshops, you can do critique groups, which everyone has their own journey, their own method to learning how to write and can convey stories in a way that are compelling and engaging and things like that. Can you talk about what you learned from your MFA program and the value you got out of it?
I really appreciate you asking me that question. I'm so thankful you asked that question because I appreciate my experience in the MFA at Arcadia University. I don't want to turn this into a commercial, but I applied to that program. I don't want to say randomly, but I've just always kind of been bookish. I come from a bookish family. I come from an extremely crafty family, and I don't really have a craft. Um, so I always kind of wondered about my ability with writing. It was just something I was kind of always interested in. So excuse my puppy here. Hold on one second. Um, I always kind of leaned in that direction. So kind of on a whim, I applied to this program and had a very fascinating first interview with Professor Izzard, who runs the program. And I kind of said, like, I don't know, like I don't think I'm a writer, but I feel like I could be a writer. Here's some people I idolize. And part of the program was I had to turn in like sample writing, and at the beginning I had nothing. So it was my first kind of experience, like, oh my God, I have a lot to write and I'm not really a writer. I don't understand. So long story short, I got put in the program and there were 13 of us and 13 very different people interested in completely different types of writing, motivated by different authors, different genres. Um, so just having people read my pieces who just saw it from a completely different perspective um, than what I was experiencing, and then conversely having to read all of their pieces too, and just kind of seeing into their own little worlds and um, taking advice that they were giving me, but taking observational advice that I was seeing them apply to their own pieces, and then ultimately having uh, hardcore writing deadlines on a rotating basis that I had to keep up with. It was kind of like a trial by fire. I forget what the word count is the first year, but you're just throwing everything out the first year just to kind of like learn your voice. Um, I just thought it was such a great experience. And also through our school, we got to go to the University of Edinburgh and in Scotland and have like focus groups together, focus time together, where we knew each other so well by the time we finished the program. So the feedback we were giving each other was very potent and very pointed. And um, I'm just so thankful for the group that I was with. And we remain in touch. And there's been several writers who have published other novels and stuff. I'm very proud of that community. I'm very thankful for that community. It was an awesome experience.
And let's talk. Since then, you have this novel now. That's your debut. We're talking in January. It comes out in April. Uh, you have some other writing credits as well. So talk about since then your journey to publication and what you're learning in beyond just the writing. What needs to be done to be a writer that gets your work out there.
Well, it's definitely very hit or miss. There's some things that I publish for, sometimes I write nonfiction. I'm an educator, so sometimes I write nonfiction articles in education, and it's like sometimes I'm very fired up about something and I write out the article and send it out, and it's like 2 weeks and it gets accepted. Other times it's like the best stuff I've written that I still can't find a home for, that I feel very passionately about. Um, I think after the MFA program, what I learned is uh, in the MFA program, it takes over your life. So you don't have the excuses of saying, well, I can't write today because I can't follow through on that idea because I got XYZ going on with my family. But um, through writing this book and some of the other publications, other short stories or articles I've written, I feel like I have the hunch to trust myself. So when I'm like, no, that's the idea. That's an idea. I got to get that out. I got to carve out time to craft that piece. And it comes back to actually the writing group. When there's times I'm unsure of something or I think something's worthy or worthwhile and I can't find a home for it and I send it to the group, they'll send me feedback. Sometimes the feedback's like, change this or that. Sometimes the feedback's like, hey, have you heard of this literary journal or this art magazine or this? Have you heard of or this place is looking for entries? Um, so just tapping into the community is so important. In the acknowledgments, I draw an analogy to beekeeping because I'm a beekeeper. So you can only beekeep by yourself. There's not really room for two people. Um, and also the decisions that you have to make, you're kind of running your own science experiment. So you can only beekeep by yourself. But at the same time, when you're part of a group of beekeepers, like a beekeeping guild, you get so much knowledge. There's so much experience. There's so many different things that can happen um, that you want to be prepared for. And it might never happen to you, but just having that background knowledge, just filling out your background knowledge is so helpful. Um, Writing, I learned, is very much the same way, being in touch with the writing community and kind of hold, it helps hold you accountable. It helps steer the boat in certain ways, but it also helps you just stay committed to like crafting the pieces because um, everybody can say, "Oh, I should create this, I should write this, I should make this piece," but um, it's a small mental switch to flip to sit down and actually get it done. But sometimes it's hard to flip that switch when there's a lot of things going on in life.
I don't want to end the interview without giving a chance to tell readers about the cover, which, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see over my right shoulder. It's interesting to me that the painter is Seth Eastman. Seth Eastman was stationed at Fort Snelling. I live in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St.
Oh,
Paul,
wow.
and Seth Eastman did dozens of paintings of Fort Snelling and the surrounding region and the Native Americans in this region. Um, so tell us about why you chose that image for the cover and what it represents.
In very like uh writerly like romanticized idea, I love the sky in the painting, and I love that the people are these little minute figures under this just immense sky. And to me, it just kind of speaks to that like those cultural touchstones that I tried to enhance in the book. And to me, it's just that painting is like one of those cultural touchstones embodied. So it's Fort Mifflin. It's where Hal was hung for desertion and murder. Um, Several scenes in the book take place in the fort. Um, but really, I guess what I like is that kind of what the book is it's about the Civil War, but it touches on kind of like bigger human emotions and bigger human ideas. And to me, that painting kind of pushes you in that same direction because it's almost got like a tilt shift effect to it. Um, I spent a lot of time looking at that painting when I was writing certain chapters of the book. So the fact that it made it to the cover is uh, really the whole thing has like come full circle in so many different ways that I love and appreciate so much that painting's on the cover.
Well, and I also love that the front cover only has a third of the painting. It kind of wraps around onto the back, so I love how that looks.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what you're working on now?
So right now I am bringing to fruition like a 30-year obsession with the kind of the big woods of Pennsylvania. Um, I grew up in an outdoorsing family, and my father was always taking us to north central Pennsylvania. It's called Potter County, and there's a rich history in Potter County of the logging era. And similar to Notes for a Desert from a Deserter, it's kind of showing change in culture, change in time period in the United States, as these guys are cutting down the hemlock forests of Pennsylvania. So the project is kind of like, I was explaining it to my son before, that it's kind of like my version of Peter Pan, where it's like as a little kid, I always wanted to be in this huge forest that doesn't exist anymore. So it's my kind of childhood dream of running through these old growth forests. But also as an adult, it's recognition of displacing indigenous peoples and overusing natural resources and kind of a scorched earth policy of building these little lumber towns, cutting down every tree, and then the machinery just moves on to the next forest. Um, so it's got a little ways to go, mainly because I feel like I'm so close to the subject. The Civil War was just, a 10-year obsession that I was researching and learning about and writing about my home state and that particular part of my home state. It's hard because I love it so much. It's kind of like um, patched onto my soul. So it's hard to see the stuff on the page and not be overly critical. But it's still got a little ways to go. Um, but I am obsessed and in love with it. And so that's my new obsession that I'm chipping away at.
Well, it sounds very interesting, and you, yeah, like you got the passion for it, so that it'll work its way out eventually.
Yeah.
Well, Chad, congratulations on Notes from a Deserter. Thanks for publishing it with us, and thank you so much for joining me on the podcast to talk about it.
Yeah, I appreciate all the support. I appreciate you taking the chance on it. And I'm extremely happy that I have kind of a new add-on to my writing community of the History Through Fiction family. I mean, so many good writers, so many awesome projects going in so many different directions. Every book is so unique, touching on so many different interesting historical time periods. I am just over the moon to be included in the catalog, and I'm very thankful for the opportunity.